So, good morning. I am eager to share with you Psalm 37. It's a longer psalm, 40 verses. So, to read it and share it means there'll be less of an introduction. And yet, there's so much to share. So, I'll give you an overview. I do try to, for myself, for you, to make each presentation a little different. So, there's an element of surprise. I'm even going to sing to you a little bit today, which is always a surprise, in that one of the verses in our psalm is the beginning of the last paragraph of Grace After Meals, Birkat Hamazon. Here's how it sounds in terms of the more popular way it's sung. Na'ar hayiti gam zaganti v'lo rayiti tzadik nezav v'zaro mevakesh lachem. Now that line translates, I was young and I have grown old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor that righteous person's children begging for food. And it's actually a change in the melody. In some communities, it's whispered. In Chabad, it's actually taken out. I'm not sure why. Bottom line, there's a change of this being sad because there might be somebody at your table who is poor and needs to be a guest. And so you don't want to embarrass them and suggest that they're not righteous or the child of a righteous person. Because again, this line, verse 25 is, I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor that person's children begging for food. And that is a verse I'll come back to. Hopefully I'll pace myself in terms of how do the rabbis understand that line? And I will add, I have a whole new understanding this morning by looking at that line in context. I'm going to give you the punchline. And the punchline in context is, this is a psalm about righteousness and how those who are righteous in community give to the poor. That will be a theme that's repeated. And you'll see that. So it's not necessarily the reason that the righteous children won't be lacking in its context is because you who are righteous, which is the next line, all day long the righteous deal graciously and lend, and their children are blessed, which is to say, if somebody is righteous, both you have been generous and more, you live in a community of other righteous, so you can feel assured that you will be taken care of. That's an understanding that's less focused on God, and yet this is a psalm. Though it's a wisdom psalm, this is not a psalm of prayer. This is not a psalm that addresses God. This is a wisdom psalm in which people are told, have faith in God. And the key theme is, for the righteous will inherit the land. Verse 9, 11, 22, 29, and 25 describe who will inherit the land, ultimately concluding with verse 25, and you will inherit the land. And I entitled this psalm, Don't Fret, which is the word from the King James translation for tidchar, which can also in its root mean burn up. Don't burn up. But I like this word fretting, because fretting has this quality of obsessing that I like. So do not fret over the prosperous wicked. This psalm will will acknowledge that there are among you those who aren't good people, who have a lot. But this is a statement of wisdom teaching. Know that in the end, whether it's by commentators in this life or in the world to come, Or in the trajectory of history, the righteous, the just, will be vindicated and the wicked will get theirs. All right, let me read so as to leave time to share with you some of those commentaries from the Talmud and other places about some of these key verses. Psalm 37, do not fret over the prosperous wicked. For David, do not fret over those who feed on evil, nor envy those who act wickedly. For like grass, they will quickly wither, and like green grass, they will fade. Trust in Adonai and do good. Dwell in the land and be nourished by faithfulness. And delight in Adonai, and God will grant you the requests of your heart. Commit your way to Adonai. Trust in God, and God will act. And God will bring forth as the light your righteousness and your judgment as the noonday. Be still before Adonai and wait patiently for God. Fret not over those who prosper in their way, of the people who devise evil plans. Let go of anger and forsake rage. Do not fret, for it only brings harm. For deceivers will be cut off, but those who hope for Adonai, they shall inherit the land. And in a little while, and there are no evildoers. You will look at their place, and they will be gone. But the humble shall inherit the land, and delight themselves in the abundance of shalom. Plots of evildoers against the righteous, and gnashes at them with their teeth. But superior laughs at them, for God sees that their day is coming. A sword is unsheathed by evildoers, and they have bent their bow to cast down the poor and needy, to slaughter those who walk upright in the path. Their sword will enter into their own heart, and their bows will be broken. Better is a little that the righteous has than the abundance of many wicked. For the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the support of the righteous is Adonai. Adonai knows the days of those with integrity, and their inheritance will be forever. They shall not be ashamed in the time of evil, and in the days of famine they shall be nourished. For the wicked will perish, and the enemies of Adonai will be as the fat of lambs, consumed in smoke. They are consumed. The wicked borrows and does not pay, but the righteous is gracious and gives. For those blessed by God shall inherit the land, and they that are cursed of God shall be cut off. It is by Adonai that a person's footsteps are established, and a person's path that God desires. Though the person falls, the person shall not be utterly cast down, for Adonai supports that person's hand. I was young, and I have grown old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor a righteous children begging for bread. All the day long the righteous deal graciously and lend, and their children are blessed. Depart from evil and do good, and dwell forever. For Adonai loves justice and will not forsake devotees. They are preserved forever, but the seed of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell forever upon it. The mouth of the righteous utter wisdom, and their tongue speaks justice. The law of God is in their heart. None of their steps slide. The wicked watches the righteous and seeks to slay. Adonai will not leave them in their hand, nor suffer them to be condemned when they are judged. Wait for Adonai and keep God's way, and God will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you shall see it. I have seen the wicked in great power and well rooted like a leafy tree in its native soil. But one passed by, and behold, was no more. I sought, but that person could not be found. Mark the person of integrity, and behold the upright, for there is a future for the person of shalom. but transgressors shall be destroyed together. The future of the wicked shall be cut off, but the deliverance of the righteous is of Adonai. God is their stronghold in the time of trouble, and Adonai helps them and caused them to escape. God will cause them to escape from the wicked and deliver them, for they have taken shelter in God. Now, this psalm, as you can see, is repetitive in terms of its message, its theme, which is that the righteous will in the end inherit the land, and that the wicked who seem now to live with abundance, that is fleeting. For ultimately, God is just. And so now, let me look at a few of the key verses, because they resonate beyond this. Let me point out, just structurally, this is an acrostic. It's the aleph bet to tough. In this case, it's a longer psalm because it's every other line. So you can see that le David, but then it's al. The first word after for David, which is do not, is the aleph. Verse 3 is the bet. Verse 5 is a gimel, and so forth. There is one letter missing. We've seen that in the previous acrostics. In this case, the letter that's missing is the letter ayin, which would be verse 29. That's where it should make its appearance, but it's absent. And if it was there, one second. It's verse 20. So it's verse 29. That would be the verse where the ayin should go, verse 29. And instead, it seems to emphasize, it's actually 3 clauses, so that you get this is all about samach. Verse 27 is samach, and then it would be second half of 28 to 29 would be the ayin. But that seems to be the key message also of the psalm. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell forever upon it. So that ayin that's missing instead has this added sentence, which is verse 29. That's where the ayin would go. And in some ways, I don't know if it's why the ayin is missing, but what it does serve to do is create a bullseye precisely by its absence. One pays attention when you walk into the room and there's a tile missing from the ceiling. This is an image of Dennis Prager. He says, your eye immediately goes to what's missing, and that becomes your focal point. And so here, the ayin that's missing, the focal point is this emphasis: the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell forever upon it. So some of those key verses. Verse 11, and again, I smile because in a larger culture, I'm aware of certain lines, and I don't, not having studied the Psalms closely, this is not a psalm, it's a long psalm that is read as part of our services. Individual verses are taken out. So verse 11, I know this line from the New Testament in Matthew 5:5, verse 11. Verse 11 first reads in the King James Version, but the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. And Jesus, preaching in the Beatitudes, Matthew 5:5, will frame it as, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And that's often used in Christian preaching, that emphasis on the meek. What's interesting is that verse was apparently also very much commented on by the Dead Sea sect. They call it Pesher, their commentaries. And likewise, like the Dead Sea sect, which was a sect that felt itself lacking strength, set aside from the larger community, so it was true for the early Christians. They too felt as if there were many obstacles in their ability to flourish. And in both cases, this becomes a central quote, a focal point. Though the rabbis will emphasize in the Hebrew, the word that's translated as meek is anav, which is more commonly translated by the rabbis as the humble. For instance, we're told of Moses, Numbers 12:3. Ha'ish Moshe haya anav ma'od. The man Moses was very humble, more so than anav, that same word, more so than any person on the face of the earth. So that meek, as understood by the word anav, was not weak, was not isolated, but rather was somebody who, the context in Numbers 12:3, his brother and sister are gossiping about his wife and his relationship with his wife. And rather than being angry at them, he prays for his sister's healing from leprosy. And that's where that verse appears, which is to say, he had the spirit of not taking himself too seriously and holding himself out as greater than anyone else. In that sense, humility is strength. Or as my teacher, Rabbi Twersky, emphasizes, to be humble as a leader like Moses doesn't mean you don't feel your power. Power being the ability to affect change, the ability to give a speech, the ability to guide and tell the people of what God wants and expects from them. It simply means he sees himself as God's servant and not it being about him. So that's verse 11, a very important verse, and it's good to have this opportunity to unpack it a little. But the verse that for me, I needed to unpack for myself is verse 25. I sang it a moment ago. I emphasized that verse 25 is part of our grace after meals. This psalm has in two places, here in verse 25 and in verses 35 and 36. Let me show you 35. I have seen the wicked in great power and well rooted like a leafy tree. But then later I sought them and they could not be found. So this is a wisdom teaching, and it comes here as well in verse 25 to say, I have a life experience that I want to share with you. And I've grown to see, verse 25, that in my life I have not seen the righteous forsaken. And so now a pause. Forsaken by whom? And the commentators will say, forsaken by God. That even when times were rough, the righteous felt they could trust in God. So the first forsaken is a spiritual forsaken, is the way the commentators largely read it. And then, nor that person's children begging for food. And here too, begging for bread, mevakesh lachem, Martin Cohen chooses to say is spiritual bread in its context. Because we have that in the prophets, that those who are hungry come and eat. And in that case, it's in the spiritual context. And so that's a way to spin this. But it's troubling. For Robert Alter, he says of these verses 26, 25 and 26, he said it's the opposite of Job. This sounds, he says, like Job's friends. So you remember the story. Job is the righteous person, and Satan says to God, Yeah, of course he's righteous because you've always given him everything he wants. But if you were to take away some of those blessings, wait, you'd see he wouldn't be so righteous. He'd curse you. And so God says, okay, go ahead, try him out. And when Job is now suffering, his friends will come and say, look, you must have done something wrong or you wouldn't be suffering. And Job says, no, it's not true. I'm righteous. Even the righteous can suffer. And here it would seem to say, nor righteous children begging for bread, the righteous are not forsaken, as if this sounds like Job's friends to Job. That for me has been a dissonance. And Robert Alter raises that to the foreground. So let me share some of the ways that the rabbis have commented on this for good and for bad. But I will say this even before I get to that, that for the rabbis, this psalm is not a statement of theology. This is not wrestling with the question, why do good people suffer? This is a psalm of assurance to people. This is not meant as a theological investigation. This is not Job wrestling. This is, if you will, Job at the end of the story, having come, as Robert Alter points out, to a more nuanced understanding of faith, an understanding that's a bit paradoxical, that God is there for you. You know, Rabbi Harold Kushner's understanding, which I love, of the Job story of why is it that after God speaks and basically says, you don't understand my acts as creator, well, how does that solve the problem for Job? And Rabbi Kushner says, it's not the answer, it's God's answering that resolves for Job the problem of suffering. The experience of God being present and caring is what matters. And so that's back to a way to understand this. The righteous are not forsaken. God is present. And now I'm getting to the punchline, but a righteous children don't beg for food because the righteous, meaning the larger righteous community, tend to children in need. So the community will be there for you, is what verse 27 and the overall psalm is about. Righteous are those who give to others. Who are the wicked? Those who don't pay their bills. They don't pay their loans. And I don't want to overlook a teaching of Rabbi Shimon of Pirkei Avot. Let me do that because I know I'm going to get too involved here. So one more psalm, and then I'll focus and wind up with verse 25. Verse 21 is quoted in the teachings of the sages, Pirkei Avot, and it's the teaching of Rabbi Shimon. And the teaching, it's 2:14. Rabbi Yochanan will say, what is the path in life that one should avoid? And different disciples have different answers. And Rabbi Shimon will quote verse 21. And he'll say, one who borrows and does not repay, for borrowing from a person is like borrowing from God, as it is said. And now quoting the verse, the wicked borrows and does not repay, but the righteous one deals graciously and gives. And in that regard, which relates to this psalm, there will be a teaching in the Talmud in which Rav will give the 4 reasons that a wealthy person loses his wealth. He pays his laborers, but with great reluctance, or doesn't pay at all. 2. 3, shirks communal responsibility. Or 4, is arrogant, as bad as all sins combined. And then we'll quote verse 14 from our psalm. They have bent their bow to cast down the poor and needy, to slaughter those who walk upright in their path. So that's another way that this psalm finds itself quoted. And that's again to underscore that this is a psalm about the righteous are identified with generosity dash communal responsibility, and the wicked are the selfish who take from others, and that's the contrast. And so back now for the last 5 minutes to Psalm 25. Samson Raphael Hirsch, a great teacher of Frankfurt, Germany of the 19th century, some identify as the creator of modern orthodoxy. He says, it doesn't say that the righteous are never reduced to poverty, for that would equate poverty with wickedness, which is an untruth. Righteous, but rather what 25 is saying is that no righteous are completely forsaken even when they beg for food, because, quote, since Jews are obligated to help one another, it is no disgrace for a person to require the help of another. And so that's why, that's the communal response of, and what 25 is going at. But the earlier rabbis, they tended to see this in ways that are troubling. So here in the Talmud, Shabbat 151a, Rabbi Yossi is teaching his students, and he teaches this line, and his students say, but isn't it a fact that scholars sometimes become impoverished, our teacher? And he says, yes, but they'll never sink so low as to have to beg from door to door. So he hedges it, and I'm not sure. Some, like Rashi, will say this is a statement not about an individual in one's lifetime, but the arc of history. And quoting here again, the Talmud, Yevamot 16b, says it's not God speaking, because God doesn't get old, but surprising to me is that there's an angel, Metatron, who's the head of all the angels, and the Zohar identified with Shekhinah, who is speaking and describing the sweep of history. So in the sweep of history, ultimately, the righteous will be vindicated. One last one. Kohelet Rabbah, one of the early Midrashim, Ecclesiastes 2:17, a description of Rabbi Meir, who was poor. He would get 3 selahs a week. So they say 1 selah was used for food and clothing. Well, 1 selah was used for food and drink. 1 selah was used for clothing, and 1 for him and his family, and 1 was used for charity, for tzedakah. And here too, his students say to him, what about saving some money for your children? To which he replies, if my children are begging, God will take care of them, because I am taught by this verse 25 that God doesn't forsake the children of the righteous. They won't beg. God will take care of them. And if, in fact, they are not righteous themselves, then that's their problem to have to beg. So that's a little bit troubling, for we don't know how old his children were when he shared that. To pull this together, because we're at 10:30, this longish psalm has its own lyricism. It's a wisdom psalm. It's a psalm that focuses on a life experienced with an exhortation to the listener that on the trajectory of life, or the trajectory of history, or the trajectory of this life to the world to come, the riches of the wrongdoer are going to disappear. Those who are righteous, they will inherit the land, whether it's the land of Israel, whether it's the land of shalom, which appears in this psalm, which I leave as shalom to suggest not just peace, but a wholeness of the inside of life, that one will be shalem, complete. So with that, I now invite your couple, 2, 3 reactions or questions to Psalm 37. Who would like to react? Richard? You have to unmute yourself, Richard. There
I
you
am okay. Okay. Just two comments. One is that I very much appreciate what you're doing here, and you're getting better at it as you go along.
Thank you. I feel the same way.
That's that. But anyway, uh, I hadn't seen you. You showed me something I hadn't seen before out of this psalm. Uh, it is a multifaceted description and definition of the wicked,
Yeah,
and a multifaceted description and definition of the righteous. And
yeah.
both of those pictures are being developed here, and I really appreciate that your presentation helped that come clear.
Oh,
I'll
thank
turn.
you. Yeah, no doubt I want to acknowledge it. There is a learning curve for me as well. And that's part of my satisfaction is I'm beginning to feel the familiarity of words. And what I seek in each case as my question as I open up a psalm is what's distinctive about this psalm? And as Richard emphasizes, in this psalm, there's a greater development of the imagery of who is righteous and who is wicked. And it comes down to generosity and responsibility within community for others in need. And that's the context of that verse. And I'll add, that's why verse 25 is sung after eating, because it's part of grace after meals. You have enjoyed the bounty, and in enjoying the bounty, you're reminded that you are to share your bounty. That's the other way to understand why verse 25 is part of grace after meals and at the very end, because as a psalm that unpacks what it means to be righteous, remember you have enjoyed, now share your food with others. And another reaction? I can't see if there is, so you'll just, Mimi, go ahead. Thank you, Mimi. Unmute. You still have to, okay, go ahead.
Oh, that now it did. No,
Yeah.
I can't unmute myself.
Okay,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Okay, now, okay. You mentioned before most of the people were on that there's also a verse in the Quran.
Oh, thank you.
Could you just tell us which verse?
Yeah, thank you. 1 second. This is where I create too many versions of these psalms. So I mentioned earlier, thank you, that this is a psalm where it's also in the Quran, Surah 21, 105, and I found this in the Wikipedia article. I go to the Wikipedia article for each of the psalms because there is a great harvest of footnotes. And here's how the Quran reads, verse 29. Before this, we wrote in the Psalms after the message, in parentheses, given to Moses, quote, my servants righteous shall inherit the earth. And so Muhammad, clearly in the oral tradition, because he himself, I believe, was illiterate, but had, in that sense, he wasn't reading Hebrew scripture, but he was engaged in conversations with merchants who were Jewish and Christian, and in that sense, learned much of scripture, and much of scripture is woven into Quran, though often blurring what's midrash and what's literal. And so here's an example of a verse from Psalms that finds its way into the Quran and is attributed to the teachings of Moses.
Thank you.
You're welcome. closing comment? Ahuva. Ahuva, last comment, and let me unmute you. There you go. Go ahead, Ahuva. I don't hear you. 1 second. Speak again, Ahuva. Eric, are you able to unmute? I've unmuted, but I'm not hearing Ahuva's voice. Ahuva, for some reason, although you're unmuted, I don't hear you.
It might be something with her microphone. I'm not sure.
So you may have a mic issue, Ahuva. No. So I can't
Rabbi
hear
Podwall has his hand up.
So with apologies, my dear Ahuva, you'll have to put it into the chat and I'll read it as the closing comment. And Rabbi Podwall?
I do have a favorite explanation that I've found satisfying for verse 25. However, before I give it, I was so busy trying to unmute myself, I didn't really totally hear your answer to Richard, and you may have anticipated my commentary. I mean, because you said something about it being a call, that we should look at it as a call to action, maybe?
Yes, but you're saying it more directly, so go ahead. A call to action in what sense?
I read verse 25 as self-criticism. You look at the verse and you say, well, this verse doesn't seem to be in reality, because we know of people who are righteous and have suffered. So this is satisfying, but it said the following: I've been young and now I'm old, and I never paid attention. I didn't see that there were righteous that were suffering and their children had to go out begging for bread. I didn't take notice. And now I have to take notice. I have to become aware. Till now, I chose not to see. And now that I see it, I choose to give to Mazon.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, the call to action. Let me conclude with Ahuva, who was good enough actually even before to put into the chat. And I noted that ayin is the one letter missing. And Ahuva wrote, verse 28 has 3 components, 3 verse sets. The first 2 make a perfect sapiential sentence. The third part does start with an ayin, but for some scribal error, its entirety was skipped over. So that's another possibility. And I honor Ahuva as a modern Bible scholar who, as a modern Bible scholar, honors the fact that sometimes a letter is missing because of a scribal error. And that could be the other reason why this is the one letter of the acrostic absent. Thank you, Ahuva. I invite those who have Kaddish to recite to honor your loved ones at this time, as we have the opportunity of the mitzvah to say Amen. Yitkadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah
Amen.
Yalma Divra Kirute V'yamlich Malchute V'chayechon Yomechon Uvchaye D'chol Beit Yisrael V'agala V'izman Kariv V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi Yitrei Rabba Mevarach Leolam Omer Maya Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei Dekudsha B'richu
Very cool.
Eila Mikol Birchata V'shmirata Tushbechata V'nechemata Damiran V'yalma V'imru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemayim V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom v'rumav, ya'aseh
Yasha
shalom,
Shalom,
aleinu
Aleinu,
v'al
V'Yakal
Yisrael,
Yisrael,
v'al Yosvei
Yimru,
Tevel, v'imru amen.
Amen.
Thanks to each of you for sharing in Psalms. I invite you to have a good Shabbat. And next week, I do hope to have 3 Psalms, which will take us to 38, 39, and 40, the cusp, and the following week with Psalm 41 to celebrate the end of book 1 of the 5 books of Psalms. So again, thank you to each of you for sharing in this learning together.